The carefully curated guest list favored those unlikely to fit into other, more rule-bound and identity-defined dungeon spaces. It was neither gender-segregated nor compulsorily heterosexual. It honored those who abided by the customs of old leather and carried its inherited wisdom, while celebrating free-form experimentation that broke with traditional subcultural knowledge and practice. Links, as its name suggested, forged connections where they otherwise might not have existed. I first encountered there the word queer, as it since has come to be used in academic and community discourse, in chill-out conversations after dungeon sessions in the summer of 1990. We used it to name the previously unnamed social formation taking shape at our parties, which we saw as part of a larger political and conceptual shift in identity-based social movements related to the AIDS crisis and, a few months later, to anti-Gulf War activism. Transgender was a word I first encountered on a flyer advertising a Lynx gender play party early in 1991. For most of us there, gender was something we explored, analyzed, and experimented with in the context of a broader engagement with bodily practices and power. People came at questions of gender from many different angles and emotional investments, with no one right way to proceed. Since the 1990s, considerable ink has been spilled about the relationship between queer and transgender, transgender and transsexual, transgender and genderqueer. For me, these things were linked at the outset. I wander one night into the dungeon's back room to find a wreathing young body upright and spread-eagled, lashed naked to an X-shaped St. Andrew's cross, its head shaved, its scalp encircled with a garland of temporary hypodermic needle piercings, through which a fine steel wire had been woven and tightened into a crown of thorns. Blood trickled down its face in an art historical tableau vivant of martyrdom, and plucked arrhythmically onto a plastic drop cloth. A woman faced the young body, checking its pulse and respiration with a latex-gloved hand, wiping the proverbial blood, sweat, and tears from its eyes and giving it occasional sips of water. Two others whom I happened to know were administering a thorough flogging. One was visibly tired. It had apparently been a long night. She gestured for me to take her place, and I stepped into the structure of the scene, surrendering myself to its established cadences. Something serene and paradoxically solitary can be found in the experience of giving oneself over to the inhabitation and enactment of a shared pattern of motion, a contemplative solitude born of one's ecstatic displacement into a space where the body actively receives and transmits the movements of others, allowing awareness to flit and alight throughout the transsubjective ensemble. A whip strikes flesh with sufficient force to blossom the creature's skin red and welt it back toward the leather. The young thing moans a low moan, transforming the kinetic energy of the blow into an audible frequency by passing breath over slack vocal cords, and my attention is drawn toward the physicality of the assemblage we cohabit. A child is being beaten, no doubt, but my sense in the moment is that the Freudians, so invested in textual analyses and narrative outcomes, fail to grasp the philosophical critical dimension of sadomasochistic practice when they approach it through the lens of Oedipal sexuality. This is not, for me, primarily a sexual experience, and it is Freud's contemporary Bergson, rather than Freud himself, who comes to mind. In a passage of Matter and Memory, Bergson discusses the structure of the nervous system in the animal series that extends, in his teleological schema, from the Monera to Homo sapiens, in which he observes that, even as a simple mass of protoplasm, living matter is irritable and contractile, open to the influence of external stimulation, to which it reacts physically, chemically, and mechanically. Stimulus response is not an event structured by the boundary between inside and outside, between interior self and external other, but is rather a continuous movement in which a force's vector is prolonged and deflected into the movements of living matter. It is as a wave transmitting itself through various media. As organisms become more complexly organized, specialized parts, nerve cells, sense organs, the musculoskeletal system, divide physiological labor in ways that permit more varied response. At some point, a neural organ, the brain, introduces the possibility of voluntary movement rather than automatic organic responses. Bergson understands the brain to introduce a difference of degree rather than kind. In a simple reflex action, a peripheral excitation transmits a centripetal movement along an afferent nerve toward the central neural processing organ, before transmitting it centrifugally back along an efferent nerve to motor cells. that direct the energy of the stimulus back into the environment and thus continue its movement in a new direction. It is the complex branching of neurons in the brain that allows for voluntary responses. Quite physically, Bergson suggests, the possibility of choice of movements is at root the lived awareness of stimuli circulating with electrochemical speed through multiple neural pathways in the brain, each of which can descend into a specific pattern of motor response. The brain, rather than having some miraculous power to change sensory input into a representation of things that can be symbolically manipulated, functions simply by introducing into the circulation of energetic flows through the body a duration, a time lag, that is to say, more space, between the stimulus and response. Our consciousness of choice of movements in response to stimuli is nothing other than our inhabitation of a brain space that holds the simultaneous presence of multiple potentials, each made possible by the physical complexity and carrying capacity of the neural network, only one of which will be actualized in a quantum-like leap to a particular one of many virtualities through the material actions of our body. Whether Bergson's story can be recognized as true by today's cognitive scientists is beside the point. Reflecting upon Bergson brings me to the place of poiesis. I envision my body as a meeting point, a node, where external lines of force and social determination thicken into meet and circulate as movement back into the world. So much that constitutes me I did not choose, but now constituted, I feel myself to be in a place of agency. I occupy a critical space, a distance between stimulus and response, created by the complex social pathways converging in the dungeon, in which through my presence I gain the capacity to choose which patterns I will repeat, or which new patterns I might envision and enact. I invent new choreographies of space and time as I dance my whip across the creature's ass. It is not that I somehow internalize as my own the structure or content of the scene in which I participate, receiving its impression the way clay would receive a sculptor's mark. It is rather a proprioceptive awareness, as I flog, of the role of my body as medium in the circuit of transmissions, and of the material efficacy I possess in my subjective ability to choose one thing rather than another, or to poetically imagine the shape of a new pattern. The imagination, Bachelard says, takes up its place here, exactly where the function of unreality comes to charm or to disturb, always to awaken, the sleeping being lost in its automatisms. Gender is a percussive symphony of automatisms, reverberating through the space of our bodies before there is an awareness of awareness itself. Who can say why I heard its music the way I did? All I know is that from earliest memory I disliked being called he and longed to be addressed as she. I wanted to look like what I considered myself to be, and perceived that I was profoundly misplaced, all of which invoked in me the utter sadness of feeling irredeemably lost and alone in a situation impossible to rectify. I was not where others looked for me, and I was where they saw me not. Lacan says that the real is the place that is always returned to. These feelings were real. I am agnostic as to their origin. I did not choose them. I chose only how I would inhabit the architecture of their effect. For a long time, the little perceiving one who had been surprised to find, while still so very young, that it was related to its place of habitation in a manner quite different than others whom it knew, remained quietly observant. It first encountered another to dwell with it in the awareness of its difference, in the 19th year of its body's extrauterine life. My girlfriend and I had just finished fucking, and I was stretching next to our bed like a well-fed cat when I felt a pinch on my left buttock. Without turning around or looking down, I swatted vigorously at what I thought were my girlfriend's fingers. As it turned out, she had leaned over to bite me playfully on my ass cheek. My slap caught her perfectly on the side of the face and sent her reeling across the room. She was sobbing, and I was mortified that I had hurt her. But what eventually became clear through her tears and my guilty self-recriminations was that she had found it terribly exciting that I had hit her, and a secret history of desire began spilling forth. She wondered if I might not do it again. In all honesty, I had never even dreamed of doing such things to another person, but just as honestly, I also have to say that something previously unnamed and unrecognized in me did not hesitate to answer yes. And so it was that I felt obliged to offer her the gift of a reciprocal vulnerability, and invited her into a realm of feelings I had always occupied without companionship. After a pregnant pause, she replied, "The hardest thing about asking you to hit me was overcoming the fear of being hit by a man." Cut to 1991, a decade later, And S&M had become for me what it was for many of the people who shared dungeon space at Link's parties, a technology for the production of transgendered embodiment, a mechanism for dismembering and disarticulating received patterns of identification, affect, sensation, and appearance, and for reconfiguring, coordinating, and remapping them in bodily space. I could hear people use names and pronouns in reference to me that I could agree to answer to. I could feel the touch upon my body of clothes that encouraged certain modes of comportment or stylized manners of moving, clothing that gendered me in the act of wearing them. In dungeon space, I could see a woman in the mirror and step into the place of woman in the structure of another's desire, to witness those bodily signs, the heaves and shudders and seeping fluids that attested to my viable occupation of that fantasized place for them. There are those who say that magic is the art and science of creating change in accordance with the will. Transsexual body modification is one such practice. It became the means through which I grasped a virtuality manifested in dungeon space and gave it a materiality capable of extending its effects beyond the dungeon walls. It is in such moments of magical transformation that, according to Bachelard, the commitment of the imagining being is such that it no longer functions as the subject of the verb to adapt oneself. This is the moment of poiesis, when that which has been grasped extends itself into the world, thereby transforming not only the imagining being, but others and the environment that holds them. My arm tires, and I take my turn supporting the young creature's head, holding its eyes with mine, cradling it and attending to its bodily needs. Such are the intimate sights of queer reproduction. This moment of dungeon intimacy is but one of many over the years that collectively will conjure a new social reality. Deleuze is right to say that sadomasochism deromanticizes love and eroticizes the world. Later, hanging out in the kitchen, I learn that my playmate calls herself Ian and lives in the world as a woman. She was just beginning a PhD program in United States history at another campus at the same university where I was in the final stages of finishing mine. We ran around together for a while, whenever she was in town, until she moved to New York. Sometimes, in the years ahead, we would happen upon one another at academic conferences. Small world.